Thank you, Cabby, and thank you to those who've come back for lunch, from lunch for this session. Let me just start by saying how grateful I am to be part of the PPF team. The work that it's doing in confronting the big challenges facing policymakers was just too difficult to resist being part of. And I think my first output with the PPF, A New North Star, produced with Robert Asselin, former advisor to our finance minister, Bill Morneau, is an example of the kind of work that the PPF is focused on and for which I'm grateful to be a part. Similarly, this discussion this afternoon further reflects the PPF's commitment to intellectual diversity and views and perspectives from across the intellectual and political spectrum. I'm pleased to introduce you to Oren, who's a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where his work on strengthening the labor market addresses issues ranging from the social safety net, environmental regulation, trade, immigration, education, and organized labor. Oren has written for publications including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, National Affairs, and he regularly speaks at universities and testifies before Congress. But the reason I'm so glad that he's here with us today is his 2018 book, The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America, which has been called, quote, the essential policy book for our time, and, quote, an unflinching indictment of the mistakes that Washington has made for a generation and continues to make today. I should say that it is one of the most audacious and provocative books on economic policy in general, and the labor market in particular. And I'm grateful that the PPF has provided him a forum to contribute to this broader conversation about the future of work. And of course, I'm grateful for Oren to be joining us from the United States to share the insights from his book and what it means for how we ought to think about work and public policy. Please welcome Oren Cass.
Sir, thank you.
So Oren, I'm going to start with a question that I know all authors like. Why did you write this book, and what's major insights? What's the thesis of The Once and Future Worker?
Yeah, I should like that question better. When I found out I'd have to answer it a lot, I wished I'd focused the book a little bit more. The book is, in a sense, a response to what we saw happening in the United States with the election of Trump. Not so much his election as the response to it. I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion, probably extending beyond our own borders, about what on earth is going on, why, given that so much of the economic data, frankly, looked so good, at the aggregate level, why were people upset? Why were people turning to this? Was it that they didn't understand how good they had it? Was it that they were too racist and xenophobic to care? And that felt to me like it was really missing something. And what I think it was missing, and what Trump really uniquely understood in a way that neither the conventional Republicans or Democrats did, was the importance of work. Was the role that work plays in people's lives, in families, communities, society, and that, obviously politicians all talk about jobs, right? Everyone has a jobs plan. But strangely, the jobs plan always tends to be convenient. It's everything you already wanted to do. So for Democrats, it was healthcare reform as a jobs plan and fighting climate change as a jobs plan. And for Republicans, cutting taxes and deregulation were jobs plans. Any place the rubber actually met the road and a priority conflicted with the interests of workers, the workers tended to lose out. And you saw this in so many areas, in the way we regulate the environment, in the way we've focused on college education over other types of pathways into the workforce, and the approach to trade and immigration and so forth. And I think it stems from how we do economics, which is based on consumer welfare. I mean, standard economics says work is actually a bad thing that you're supposed to minimize. All of those models that we trust to tell us so many useful things are all about optimizing everyone's well-being as a consumer. And so one of the things that we take for granted, and economists will say, yeah, this is what we were assuming, and it's built into this idea of growing the economic pie, is it actually doesn't matter who does the work. It doesn't matter what the quality of jobs is. As long as we're getting aggregate growth, as long as we then have redistribution so everyone's slice of the pie gets better, everyone should be happy. And I think the way to understand what was happening in the US, what's happening more broadly in the developed world, is that the workers who are left behind by that, they are consuming more than ever thanks to redistribution and cheaper consumer prices, but who are losing their ability to be productive contributors to the economy, they're saying, that's not the deal we're signing up for. We're actually interested in work. That's what we want. We want to be productive contributors. We want to be able to support our families and our communities through that work. And that has to be the non-negotiable starting point. And for all that we probably won't, but I'd be happy to talk at great length about all things that are wrong with Trump. But that fundamental insight, I think, is actually right. And building up an explanation of why it's right and then understanding what it would mean for policy, I think is a critical project for the West generally, and that's what I was trying to contribute to.
For those of you who were fortunate enough to attend last night's reception where PPF fellow Peter Lowen presented some findings on the interrelationship between economic anxiety and populism, he made the same observation, that for all of the flaws of populist politics, its capacity to discern things that more conventional politics has neglected is its greatest strength. Amongst its weaknesses is its tendency to be incapable to respond to what it discerns. And I think, in a way, your book is trying to develop an agenda that responds to what President Trump and others have discerned.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's built around what I call the working hypothesis, which I wanted to call the book The Working Hypothesis. I thought it sounded like an edgy Jason Bourne thriller kind of thing. and the publisher said it sounded like a boring, wonky book that no one would want to read. And I said, well, it is a boring, wonky book. But
which I'd encourage you all to read.
Which you should all read, which you should all, of course, read.
Well, actually, more importantly, you should buy. Whether you read it matters less.
Some of my friends said I couldn't get past page 50. I said, that's fine, as long as you bought a copy. My mom, I made read it. But the working hypothesis is that, the short form is that work matters. The longer form is that a labor market that reaches an equilibrium where people of all capacities in all places can find work that's going to support strong families and communities is the central determinant of our long-term prosperity, and so should be the central focus of our public policy. And the crucial thing to understand about that is that for all the wonderful things that free markets do, nowhere is it written in economics that the efficient outcome for the labor market is going to be one that achieves that. If we actually have that social value for work, if we want a particular labor market outcome, not just the efficient labor market outcome, then you have to rethink a whole lot of policy. And so I think it's a helpful framing mechanism to then go through and say, well, from the supply side of the labor market, how do our policies affect who comes into the market, what they're prepared to do? From the demand side, how do our policies affect what kinds of jobs we create, what investors and entrepreneurs want people to do? How do we draw borders around our labor market? That actually matters a lot if you care about work and not just about low prices. There's a lot of interest, frankly, on the right of center about doing organized labor better. I mean, we have a uniquely horrible organized labor system in the United States. But if you care about work, the answer isn't just get rid of it, because the less power workers have, the cheaper things are. It's to find a better system. And so I think when you put the labor market at the top like that, you start to see an awful lot of things that we've done wrong, and you start to see an awful lot of opportunities to do things better.
Before we get to the policy implications of your vision of the working hypothesis, maybe one preliminary question. How will the broader economic and technological trends that we've been discussing so far today, how are we seeing those trends challenge the role of work and people's perception of work?
So it's certainly challenging the perception. I think it's frankly not really challenging the reality. I am what I would call at once an arch techno-skeptic and therefore an arch techno-optimist, which is to say, I think technological change is actually happening incredibly slowly, and as a result, we don't have to be scared of it. In fact, to the contrary, we should be trying to do more. And when you think about what automation actually is, when you think about what introducing technology into a process is, the premise is you're trying to boost somebody's productivity. You're trying to be able to get more output with less labor. And we measure incredibly carefully productivity growth. We know how much productivity growth we are getting in this economy. And at least speaking for the US and true generally in the developed world, productivity growth is slowing. It is, even in manufacturing, slower than it has been historically. Economy-wide, it's pretty much at an all-time low on a historical record going back to the 1800s. And so what that means is we're actually automating less quickly than ever. Now, there are other drivers of productivity besides just automation, which actually I think help think about it. I mean, think about the story of, a firm introduces a machine that allows 90 people to do the work that 100 used to. And we say, well, that destroyed 100 jobs. Sorry, that destroyed 10 jobs. But now think about a firm that makes these massive investments in training and reimburses tuition and sends everybody to school, and it's incredibly effective. And by the end of the year, 90 people can do the work that 100 did before. But no one would say that training destroys jobs, right? That sounds ludicrous. It in fact has exactly the same economic effect. We're just scared of robots because we can anthropomorphize them. But as I said, the data shows the technological change is happening slower than it has in the past. And I think we should expect that to continue to be a challenge for us, partly just because, yes, artificial intelligence and robots are cool, but what else is really cool? Electricity, right? The computer. I mean, in a sense, we've kind of already hit the low-hanging fruit. And these new technologies are, frankly, less extreme leaps forward. And they are more complex. They are harder to deploy. And in our more complex organizations, they take a very long time. And so, yes, we have all sorts of technologies in the lab that appear like they can do all sorts of things. But we had computers in the lab in the 1940s, and your HR department is still trying to figure out how to use them. And that's going to be the case in the 2070s. We're still going to be looking around saying, how do we actually deploy artificial intelligence effectively in our business processes? And in particular, by the way, who do we have that can use it well? Because there's no secret pool of layabout skilled technology workers waiting to come in and take the existing workforce's jobs. The existing workforce is all we have. And so we can try to invest in training, but at the end of the day, they're going to be the constraint on how fast we can go. And that's what then makes me optimistic. In that sense, they actually have the power. Firms that succeed are going to be the ones that actually do figure out a way to make the workers who already actually exist work well with these technologies and be more productive. And so yes, it is going to be slow, but there's no reason to expect it to be any different from the formula that we've had in the past, which is that when you get that right, that's the path to productivity increases, to higher wages, to better jobs. And that's what I hope we see. That's what we should want more of.
So Ed's plan to replace all PPF workers with robots is going to be stymied by our inability to do so. That's good. That's relieving to know.
Your reports could probably be done.
You mentioned earlier that the book is at its core a policy book. Do you want to just unpack some of the areas of public policy that are affected by your proposal to reconceptualize economic policy and some of the reforms that you think ought to fall out of such a vision for economic policy making?
Yeah, sure. So let me start with sort of the two basic ones, the demand side and the supply side of the labor market. I think the supply side is what we've been talking about a lot today. It's about education and training at the end of the day. And at least in the US, it's really about recognizing that we've done things exactly backward, and we've focused literally all of our resources on college graduates. Okay, we've converted our high schools into essentially college prep academies. We then have $150 billion a year that we subsidize higher education. And yet fewer than half of Americans complete even a 2-year degree. If you're not on that pathway, you get 0. And so the exact segment of the population that we believe are the economic winners, that should have the capacity to fund their own training, that are moving into a robust labor market, get all of the support, and the other half get nothing. And that's ridiculous and backward. And there are plenty of good ways to build non-college pathways, but it requires two real concessions. It's really, at least in the US, much more a political and cultural problem than it is a technical policy one. I mean, we know how to do this. And one of the prior sessions was talking about this. That doesn't mean it's easy to import a new culture and set of systems, but we have good models out there in Europe in particular. We have some good models in the US. There are isolated places where people have gotten together and are doing it really well. The two challenges are, first of all, you have to get comfortable with tracking. You have to get comfortable with the idea that you're going to, during high school, put people on different pathways. I think you leave that up to the family, which pathway they want to choose. You put the onus on the policymakers to create a non-college pathway that's actually attractive. But at the end of the day, you actually have to put people on pathways. And that makes people very, very upset. And the way I think you break through that is you recognize we already put people on pathways. It's just there's only one. And it's not serving most people. And you say, look, if we really are committed to only having one pathway, then let's make it one for the median student who is not going to be a college completer. So every school will be a vocational school. And if you want college prep for your child, you can send him 3 towns over. And if that was what no tracking meant, then you can bet that all the self-righteous upper middle class families would get behind tracking very quickly. Because there's no such thing as no tracking unless everyone gets their own tutor. By definition, tracks exist. We should have one that serves those who are being least well served. So that's one thing we have to get comfortable with. And then the other thing we have to get comfortable with is just the fact that not everyone is going to be a college graduate. That in fact, about 2/3 of people, as far as we can tell, are not well served by anything like a traditional college education. And that's just been an incredibly sticky figure in the United States across decades of doubling our spending, of doing everything we can think of. The share of people who actually earn a 4-year degree by the age of 25 has moved maybe a couple of percentage points. That's just not where we're going to get the movement. And so we have to accept that and be prepared to go in other directions. So that's sort of on the supply side. The demand side, I think, gets a lot less attention, again, because of this consumer welfare obsession that we have that says all jobs are equal. I mean, it's fascinating to me, at least in the United States, we do all of this cost-benefit analysis of our environmental regulations. We're very proud of how EPA, like, here's our 800-page cost-benefit analysis for some environmental regulation, does not mention employment. Employment is not considered a cost of a regulation. Because, first of all, we don't care. This is consumer welfare that we're trying to measure. And to the extent that we do care, we consider it the Federal Reserve's job to maintain full employment. So assuming you've got the Fed funds rate at the right level and a full employment economy, everyone will have a job. Will it be as good a job? Will they get less? We don't know. That is irrelevant to how we do the analysis. At one point, the Obama administration actually got pushed on this. Why shouldn't we be talking about employment? So they started adding something where they said, well, here's how much it's going to cost to install the pollution and control equipment. And those are all jobs. So maybe the regulation creates employment. But we know from actual econometric studies that higher levels of regulation, particularly focused on the industrial economy, suppress investment and new plant creation and wages in those industries. And the problem is that those industries are exactly the ones that provide the best employment, particularly for men, particularly for men who have a comparative advantage in physical over mental labor. That's where the good jobs are. It's not that we have this arbitrary, archaic clinging to manufacturing. It's that manufacturing is where an awful lot of workers can be most productive. It's also incredibly important to communities. Every local community has to make something the rest of the world wants, right? Because there's an awful lot it wants from the rest of the world. You can be a services economy, but you can't all serve each other coffee. And if you try to do that, if you take away the industrial capacity of a community, all they have left is to do what I call exporting need. that reliance on government transfer programs becomes the mechanism by which resources come into the community. And so in the US, you drive around sort of a depressed area and you see the stereotypical dilapidated shopping mall. But in the middle of it is a sparkling new occupational therapy office. Well, what's that doing there? That is literally the town's exporter. It is exporting to the rest of to taxpayers care for the people on disability in the community. And so when you see like, well, healthcare, that's the one booming sector everywhere, it's not because healthcare is great, it's because it comes with a blank check to pay from outside the community for anything anyone wants in that sector uniquely. So if you actually say it's not enough to get economic growth that looks like booming financial and tech and research and development in coastal megacities while the industrial economy shrivels, which I think sounds like a reasonable statement, but is again in conflict with standard economics and how we make public policy, then you have to actually say like, well, we should probably take that into account when we regulate. We should probably not continue down this path of making it as hard and costly and risky as possible to do things in the physical world and as attractive and easy and high return as possible to do things in the digital world. And economists will get very upset by that because the highest dollar value is in these digital services, and as long as we create enough wealth, we can transfer it to the people who are left behind. But the number of assumptions that are not correct embedded in that answer are exactly what causes the problems that we are facing, I think. And so those are the kinds of levers I think we have to pull differently than we have.
Well, let me ask you a question that was on my mind throughout the book. I said when I introduced you that it was one of the more audacious and provocative books I've read on public policy in some time. But one question that was in my mind throughout was, how can policymakers tip the scales in favor of workers without creating huge distortions that harm growth and dynamism? One could envision the working hypothesis used to justify really bad public policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, I think when you put the political economy lens on all of this, you have to ask, okay, but what's actually going to work? And I think, from my perspective, the right way to approach that challenge is to recognize that the answer isn't a whole bunch of new big programs. In fact, I believe I very carefully made sure that the entire book of hundreds of pages of policy, whatever, creates no net increase in programs or spending. What it's talking about is all of the areas of policy where we already have to decide. It's not about, when you have the labor market as your area of focus, you have a problem on the right that has just said, well, we're just going to trust the market. Whatever the market does is per se correct. But you also have a problem on the left, which is to say, well, if we don't like what the market is doing, we will command it to do something different. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't tend to generate very good outcomes either. The way I think you have to think about it is to say, look, the labor market any market is just a neutral processing mechanism. It takes the conditions it's operating in and spits out an answer. And if you're not happy with that answer for some reason, then you have to go back to those conditions and ask, what are the conditions that are generating that answer, and why do they exist in society generally? And so when you go through these areas of policy, what you say is, look, we've already made choices, for instance, about how we do environmental regulation. But if the calculations we're doing as we make those choices are the wrong calculations, we should make different calculations. We've already committed to public education. There aren't a whole lot of folks out there who would say, well, we should just get rid of public education. That's not a public goal. So assuming it is, the question is, to whom is it tailored? And what's kind of the vision that you're trying to pursue? When you get to trade and immigration, again, unless you're going to have open borders, you're going to have an immigration policy. So the question is, does effect on the labor market count? Do you want to look at labor market conditions when you're deciding how you tailor who comes in through the immigration policy? Trade, I think, is the one that comes closest to running afoul of this concern, where our default has been closer to saying, well, let's just have free trade. And I think it's a fair question or challenge to say, okay, but as soon as we accept anything besides just let's have free trade, you're opening this Pandora's box. And the reason I reject that view is that I think there's actually a real paradox between free trade and free markets. And what I mean by that is that to the extent you embrace free trade, you embrace the entire regulatory legal infrastructure of sovereign areas outside of your control. You literally import China's entire economic model into your market. So you can do total free trade and say, we're just going to define our market as including all of these jurisdictions that have these crazy distortions in them. But you can't point to that and say, see, that's the free market position. You have, in fact, brought all of those distortions into the US market. You could go to the other extreme and just say, well, then we're just not going to have trade. We're just going to build a metaphorical wall around the country and have a free market in it. But that's obviously not ideal either. And so I think it's one of these areas where we have to acknowledge, what we thought was the first best, simplest model isn't actually. The default isn't no distortions. It's distortions over which we have no control that people who are, frankly, trying to beat us are aggressively manipulating. And so you have to counter that. How you counter it is where the political economy question comes in. And so I'm not a fan of tariffs as the correct response. I don't think you can kind of try to go and figure out how to put all these taxes on and just, I think the industry capture concerns are too large. But I do think you have to say, first of all, you're going to aggressively confront and prosecute people who are distorting your market. And there a tariff could make sense, not because we think it's good economically, but because we think it's a good weapon. I just think we have better weapons, things that hurt other places more and hurt us less. But we should be aggressively confronting countries that are distorting the market. And then we should actually have industrial policy, because if you take seriously this idea that work has social value, that certain kinds of work in certain industries have identifiable higher value that we need to support, then that is a place to have policy. And it's a place where we do policy well in other areas. I mean, in healthcare, we have the NIH, National Institutes of Health. We spend tens of billions of dollars a year on research because we know healthcare has value. Then we have an incredible system of hospitals and put hundreds of billions of dollars into funding those services for people. Like when we pick an industry that we actually really care about, we make policy for it. And if there are industries that are crucial to the long-term trajectory of the economy and to the health of communities and to families and to good work for people, then I think those are legitimate subjects of policy.
We have a couple of minutes left, so maybe as we wrap up, why don't you share with the audience the reaction to the book and its lines of argument across the spectrum, but I think particularly on the right, where the book and its ideas have galvanized a real debate. And then secondly, your views on the prospects for the book and its ideas having influence on how Republican policymakers in particular, but American policymakers more generally, think about public policy through 2020 and beyond.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the left of center is a little bit confused by this to the extent they want to talk about it. But I think there's an interest in it. It's a different lens through which to look at some of these things. On the right of center, it speaks directly to this real split we're facing, where what we've called American conservatism has actually been this coalition of conservatives and libertarians, and sort of the Cold War, what we call fusionism.
Yes.
And there was basically a deal where you had the foreign policy hawks, the social conservatives, and the economic libertarians, and they were going to form a bloc. And the foreign policy hawks were going to get to set foreign policy, and the economic libertarians were going to set economic policy, and the social conservatives were going to do social policy. And everyone was going to kind of be happy with that arrangement. It was a good way to win the Cold War, frankly. But what we're discovering is that conservatives and libertarians actually have very different views about markets. For libertarians, the market is the end unto itself. Per se, what the market delivers is what you want. For conservatives, markets are a great way to organize things. They're a powerful means, but they are a means to a greater end of social cohesion and well-being. And at the point where markets don't deliver that, libertarians and conservatives all of a sudden realize they disagree very strongly on things they always just sort of assumed they agreed on. And that's what I think is going on in America. I think that's a helpful way to understand what Trump has represented. He's not necessarily a libertarian or a conservative, but he sort of shoved his thumb into that wound very, very aggressively. And we're now seeing this sort of fight play out. And one of my goals with the book, and something I think it's succeeded at, is kind of being one of the standard bearers for the conservative version of the argument. And the big questions then for American politics going forward really are, one, what is post-Trumpism going to look like? As long as Trump is president, that is going to dominate everything that happens on the policy front and prevent a whole lot of real change from happening, I think. But what is post-Trumpism? What does the first Republican nominee after Trump look like? And that's what we're all fighting about. I very strongly hope that it will look more like what I'm talking about, which is taking some of Trump's impulses and fashioning them constructively. But there are a whole lot of people who think if we can just keep our heads down until Trump's done, we can go back to what we were doing before.
Yes.
And so that fight will continue to play out, and it will be part of a broader realignment. My suspicion is you're going to see a lot of libertarians head over the mountain into what we call the Democratic Party, and you're going to see an awful lot of what is left of blue-collar Democrats come over the mountain into what we will call the Republican Party, and it will unfortunately be a much more class-oriented division between a college-educated party and those interests, which we will call the Democrats, and a non-college-educated party, and that's what we will call the Republicans. And frankly, that is a horrible equilibrium. So hopefully we will come up with something a little bit more interesting than that. But I think that's where we're headed, and I think it's really important to build a platform that addresses the concerns of the folks who the economy aren't serving, and for whom move to a city, go get a college degree, or take this check are not acceptable answers.
Well, I think you've made an important contribution towards that and I'm grateful that you joined us today to share that perspective. I'm sure on behalf of everyone here, I just thank you for participating in today's conference.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.